Okay, morning everyone. So we're here for the second round of TOK panel discussions at ICHK. We're going to start with number 3, and that's how can we reconcile the relentless drive to pursue knowledge with the finite resources we have available. We'll discuss with reference to the natural sciences and one other area of knowledge. And joining me today is Ross Parker. Ross Parker is our head of technology, really, and one of the SLT members here. He's also written a book called Screens Eat Children. So I think we might want to talk about the effects of AI and knowledge and technology. And Erin Lowes is she's from the, I think, maths, but also predominantly the arts background. So, we'll probably unpack from those 3 angles predominantly. So if I can get the ball rolling, one of the things that draws my attention is this idea of a relentless drive to pursue knowledge. On my car journey in, I was actually listening to a podcast, a lecture by Alan Watts. He was a British counterculture figure. He was a student and then philosopher in Eastern religion. He went and studied in Japan and then helped to transmit some of these ideas back across to the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, he was propounding that there were lessons to be learned from a Buddhist perspective. A relentless drive, I think, is something that we can find within the global capitalist economic system. And I think it's a problematic thing if we don't stop and pause and reflect, if we're just relentlessly pursuing knowledge. I also want to probably make I'm going to look at the idea of finite resources. I think we've got one planet, so I'm the sustainability coordinator. I'm going to lean into ideas in our discussion today about how we know that we are unsustainable in our consumption patterns. We're burning through the finite resource of what's available on planet Earth, and it's problematic. So defining what knowledge is, I think an indigenous knowledge system would have a very different interpretation about how positive is our pursuit of knowledge. Ross, can I turn to you first on this? What were your takeaways?
Excuse me, can you pick up that?
Oh, yes. Does that sound okay? Fantastic. I think human beings are unavoidably learning creatures. I think we learn whether we want to or not. So we're always exposed to input from the environment. We're constantly turning that input into patterns, and then that is changing the structure of our brains and how we perceive the world and what we expect. So I think that kind of relentlessness is part of being human. And I think we've built all of the technologies that sustain us from that innate curiosity and that constant desire to learn. What really interests me as a technologist is the accelerating rate of technological development, right? So for hundreds of thousands of years, the most important human technology was the hand axe. In the last 200 years, we've gone through thousands of key technologies. So there's no doubt that technological progress is rising exponentially. Is that because of knowledge? Is knowledge powering that, or is that powering the accumulation of knowledge? It's probably both. So I think we are at a really interesting point in human history. We're connected at all times to the internet. It is sifting through knowledge more and more consciously through AI. We're accumulating knowledge as a society, but we have far more knowledge than we can ever possibly deal with. So yeah, we're in a very tricky position where knowledge has long been scarce. We now find that knowledge is too abundant for us to deal with.
Okay, so before we throw it over to Erin, we watched a clip yesterday about Elon Musk's SpaceX booster returning. It was incredible footage of seeing this huge cylinder of steel return through the atmosphere and land through the chopstick technique in its landing towel. Well, there we've got an example of Elon Musk's idea, which is to promote intergalactic or interplanetary travel to try to establish human bases on other planets. That's one solution potentially for the problem that we have with 8 billion people on one planet. But we were discussing in class whether that's the best solution. Is that going to help out not just the 1%, but maybe the 0.001% of people on the planet, and probably even smaller proportion than that? So maybe one of the things knowledge does is it depends in what is it pursuing? Is it pursuing something that's profit driven, or is this technology going to allow us to innovate and explore and open up other potential frontiers for our species? But yeah, Erin, what were your first thoughts on this title?
Thank you. Yeah, there's obviously a lot to unpack here, but I think the thing that stood out for me is the idea of finite resources. And when I was thinking of finite resources, what I was thinking of is time. Like, all of us have limited amount of time. I think one way that you could potentially address this within your essay is moving towards the idea of personal versus shared knowledge, because obviously when you look at shared knowledge, we do have more time as a collective. I mean, individual humans come and go, but the collective lives on, carries on, and a lot of the accelerating rate of knowledge that I think Ross spoke about has to do with us building upon prior knowledge from previous generations. So that was one thing that really stuck out in my mind. I also, just moving into an arts perspective, one thing that often causes controversy is whose story gets told, right? Because that also ties into finite resources. So if you follow like the Hollywood film scene, it's, they're making superhero movies because that's where the money is, right? Which also ties into our capitalist society. And so it's that story that's being told. There's a lot recently within the last probably 5 or 10 years, a lot of increasing knowledge about kind of a broader cultural awareness about the danger of a single story, right, which is a famous TED Talk, Chimamanda Achebe. But I think that idea of finite resources also comes into play in the arts with the idea of AI-generated writing. A friend of mine who's an author went into a bookstore just this past week, and it was a local author, and she was signing her books, and so my friend just bought one without thinking, and then she got home and she was reading it, and she was like, this is definitely AI generated. And then that leads into a lot of questions for the arts and people especially who are into art and design and writing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really ties into the quality of knowledge. There was a recent example of a book that was published on Amazon that instructed human beings on how to locate mushrooms in the wild, how to forage for mushrooms in order to pick and eat them. But it turned out to be an AI-generated book, and a lot of the information was factually incorrect. In fact, if you foraged for mushrooms following the book, you would probably die from eating poisonous mushrooms. So I found this to be a really illustrative case that, yes, we're accumulating this knowledge faster and faster, but what's the provenance of it? How can we trace it back to its source? How reliable is it? How good is it for us? Certainly the prospect of a future of AI-crafted books that kill us gave me pause.
Yeah, I think there's also a connection there with the natural sciences, which is the main area of knowledge that you would need to discuss with this question. Because obviously you have big examples like nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, right? Where you had this drive to pursue knowledge for whatever reason, and then we end up developing this technology which could kill us, or lots of other smaller examples. And then you have, even within medicine, all three of us, I think, listened to a podcast that Toby recommended, that very long one. It was like 2 hours long, and it talked about game theory and all of this. And one of the things that stuck out to me about that, from that podcast, was that in the US, where a lot of the R&D in medicine comes out of, basically you can't patent certain things, like natural compounds, you can't patent them. And so there's this drive to artificially create things because then you can patent it and then you can make money off of it, which you need to fund your continued R&D. So I think this question has really wide-reaching implications for a lot of areas of our lives.
Yeah. Thanks. I want to just go and look at another key term within the title. How can we reconcile the relentless drive to pursue knowledge with finite resources? I was very lucky to go to Japan in my half-term break, and I visited Hiroshima. And here's a collection of testimonies by John Hershey. And we have a science teacher, Kevin Thomas, who went on a school trip to Japan. And in terms of finite resource, like one of the survivors, the students were very fortunate to meet one of the people who were a victim, and they lost family members as a 4-year-old, but still alive. So finite resources from history would be those eyewitness testimonies that are... You have to catch them now. I mean, that's one of the positive things maybe that AI can do. So with the Shoah Foundation, Holocaust testimony, the ability to digitize recordings to make sure that these stories stay alive and with us. One of the ways in which, the relentless drive to pursue knowledge, if you watch the Oppenheimer film, you can see there is a man relentlessly pursuing in a kind of feverish way with the abundance of infinite national military economic resources to achieve this deadly technology. But then once that technology is unleashed, the consequences of that upon the genetic mutations, the disfigurements, the psychological horror that delivers to a population beyond the immediate moment of the explosion, it is something that's not considered when we're relentlessly pursuing it. And so I visited, one of the ways you can reconcile it is to try to come to terms, and this is a leaflet from the peace museums and the memorial museums. And as Henry pointed out, one of the Nobel Prizes went, I think, just in the last couple of days to a group of Hiroshima survivors who have kept this message about peace alive and in the consciousness, and probably in a time where we are closer to midnight on the what's that clock called?
Doomsday clock.
The doomsday clock, with ecological and military and all of the other climate-related potential disasters that are coming. So I think, are there any other key points you'd like to bring up, or should we bring that to a conclusion?
I'm okay there?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next essay title is number 2. Is our most revered knowledge more fragile than we assume it to be? Discussed with reference to the arts and one other area of knowledge. So, what I'd like to start with this. I mentioned in the last title discussion, I just got back from Japan, and this is a modern art museum in the centre of Hiroshima, the Hiroshima Museum of Art. And I'll post some resources from this, but they have a European section, so it's Monet to Renoir and Millet to Manet and Van Gogh. And so you can see the evolution of ideology and artistic styles across different cultural contexts. And these objects are stored in museums. They're priceless, and you'll get a sense that if you see a curator go through a collection of artifacts, either in a historical repository, that they might wear white gloves, and these might be in very carefully controlled spaces so that we can preserve the fragility of the manuscript or the scroll or the painting. So I think fragility there is the physical quality of it. These things are unique and very rare and very precious, and that's why that they have such important value to us. and we revere it. So we build museums and art galleries, and we hold art auctions, and we declare things to be priceless. So I think from the arts, there's lots you can do there with examining royal academies and the canons of literature in different Japanese or British or American canons of literature. And a lot of if you go to somewhere like, I don't know, the British Museum, or if you go to the National Portrait Gallery, what you'll see is a trajectory, like a thread of classical art traditions. And that's coming right back from the Western perspective, back to ancient Greece. So a Hellenic statue, you might think about Aphrodite, or if you can think about a carved marble statue that represents the most beautiful proportions in the Greek ideal of beauty. And we see these ideas taken up and developed by the Romans in antiquity, and then there's a collapse of civilization in Western Europe following the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages, these are often referred to, before a renaissance, a rebirth of old ideas. And so people are looking at the fragments of the temples, the mausoleums, the colosseums that are littered around Rome, and realizing this was once a great civilization. So some of these things are physically robust enough that they're permanent enough that you can still go to Rome and wander at the Colosseum. But these empires and these ideologies collapse. And I think if you go to a modern art museum, like in Hong Kong, you go and visit the M+, you can see radical artists with radical ideas shifting and changing and challenging the orthodoxy. So that would be my opening remark for the arts. How about you, Erin?
Yeah, that ties into something that I just read this weekend in the New York Times. There's an exhibit, I think it's at the Met in New York City, where they have Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, which is the painting that they named the Impressionist movement after. And so the Impressionists were this group that were turned away. They weren't allowed to exhibit in the salon, right? And so they kind of started their own movement. And then alongside that, in this exhibit in the Met, they have the paintings that were exhibited at the salon that year. And it like there's stark contrast, right? And we can see the thread, yes, but also that what people value culturally can shift, sometimes quite drastically and quite kind of suddenly, which I think Ross can probably speak more to that. So that, I think, was one thing that came to my mind. And then I've forgotten my next point, so I'll come back to that later.
I think for me a really good way into this is to consider the physical property of entropy, right? So for any physics students or any metaphysics students, the universe has a tendency to reduce order, to take structure and gradually break it down. That's just one of the fundamental properties of the universe. And life is the process of gaining energy and fighting entropy. So simply keeping your body intact requires energy to fight the natural decay of the universe. The same thing in keeping your house clean, in growing crops. So we are entropy fighters. And information is not immune, right? Information is actually particularly susceptible. Knowledge is particularly susceptible to entropy. So for me, a good way to think about this is how much energy do we need to expend in maintaining the information that we have. That might be energy in terms of climate control in museums, in terms of security to keep certain pieces of work secure. But now most of our information is digital. So how much information, how much energy do we invest collectively in our information systems? It was one of the biggest users of electricity to maintain this information, to keep checking it and backing it up and making sure that it's intact. So for me, all knowledge is fragile because it takes maintenance. And then it begs the question, what knowledge are we deliberately maintaining? What knowledge are we allowing to decay over time? And in an era of constant connectivity, what systems bias or change our focus on information? And for me, that's probably, other than entropy, that's probably the biggest threat to knowledge today, is the fact that we've built systems that allow people to make a lot of money by deliberately distorting information. And we call that social media, right? Social media is designed to give you a particularly distorted view of reality that keeps you hooked to it. And that then changes the nature of the knowledge that we have. So for me, there's two really important areas of focus: entropy and the technologies of information. Oh, did you?
Oh, right, I remembered my other point. I think if you address this question when you speak with reference to the arts, you would want to look at postmodernism and like Foucault's death of the author and what is authorship, and I can't really go more into it right now. I think it would take too long, but I think if you address this question, I would recommend looking into that.
Again, we're both English teachers, so from the arts, I think one of the things that really disrupts and creates this modern or postmodern world are the cataclysmic events of the First World War. It's where there was a kind of logical, rationalist endeavour where all of these competing empires were jostling against each other and trying to race to weaponise and create a kind of like, was it maybe a Darwinian survival of the fittest, and of course it brought European civilization to collapse, and that beget a crisis of identity, because if the political powers, the cultural powers that were the authorities that led your nation to this cataclysmic event, then your foundations of certainty and belief were shattered. And so there are a range of different artists that come out of this, like the jazz movement, for example, breaks down all of the quite rigorous rules of classical music. If you go and see a classical performance, there are kind of virtuoso pianists and soloists, but in general it's the ability to follow a set of rules, but to such perfection that's when we see a ballet dancer or an opera singer, they're performing things that are just so according to the rules of these royal academies. Well, just joining us now, would you like to come in? So, Mr. Hall is our history teacher and head of humanities. We're looking at number 2. Is our most revered knowledge more fragile than we assume it to be? When we've talked about this before, you mentioned Amritsar from a historical perspective. So, could you speak to that?
Thank you. One of the views held by many historians, certainly of the 20th century, was the idea that empire was generally good. Empire was a force for good in the world, and that it enhanced the progress, the development of nations that otherwise would have remained backward, in inverted commas, for centuries, for years. And that the British type of empire was much nicer, much more generous than the French, the German, and certainly the Belgian types of empire, and therefore Britain was force for good. However, in the late 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st, there was a lot of review of how the British actually governed their territories, their mandates, their colonies, and there was an obvious realization that the views and ideas of those that were governed were not being taken into account, that we weren't considering the roles of the non-white people that lived in the colonies as an idea of how things experienced. And one of the really good examples of this was the massacre at Amritsar, which was Jallianwala Bagh, which was an open space in Amritsar where the British troops basically cornered a very peaceful meeting, a congregation of people taking their time in like a park, like think of Victoria Park, taking their time, and they moved in there with rifles and a machine gun and basically mowed down the population or the people in that area, men, women and children. Some in the region of 1,500 rounds of ammunition were fired at an unarmed crowd. This was largely ignored at the time, And although many people spoke out against the leader, which was General Dyer, the person who'd conducted this, people spoke out against him. He was given a full pension, and actually in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, he was given a standing ovation. He was praised for his actions at telling the natives how they should behave. And this was largely ignored, and many historians said this was a sorry incident, but it wasn't a major example until it was reviewed by a historian called Kim Wagner, who's Dutch, I think, and he looked at Amritsar as an example of the underlying treatment of people, and it really did pull apart the idea of most revered knowledge, this idea that the colonialism and empire project was good for the world. But it is good if you're white and male. It's not so good if you happen to be darker skinned and female or just darker skinned. It didn't work so well for you. So this is an example of that from a historical perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we could look at the natural sciences as well. So I think I certainly have this notion that knowledge produced in the natural sciences is kind of robust and credible and peer-reviewed and replicated, although there are these paradigm shifts. Thomas Kuhn describes the paradigm shifts within scientific revolutions. So our conception of the world, which a really extreme example and probably quite a cliched example for your essays would be the idea of a heliocentric conception of how the galaxies and the universe is organised, and then Copernicus coming along and tearing down that conception through logic and reason and mathematical proofs. So I think to the point of post-colonialism, we can see something as fragile as the Mona Lisa, like one parchment, one painting that exists, and we can maybe look at more robust symbols of power and culture and authority. These could be represented in the sort of the banks and the government buildings and the installations and the forts, the castles that are displays of empire and prestige, like Hadrian's triumphal arch outside the Colosseum. But then you have things that lend a sense of permanence to a culture and its ideas, and there's been the tearing down of statues in the last 3 or 4 years as people find out more about the legacy of, in America, it's the southern legacy of the generals, some of which were slave owning, and in Britain's the economists who were seen as philanthropists, but often if you were to investigate the roots of the family, they have plantations over in the West Indies or for example. Okay, any other final thoughts on this one? Okay, well, there's much more we could say, and we will put a collection of the resources and references in the notes when these are released. Thank you. Okay, and our final talk then is about essay title number 1. Do historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence? Well, we're really lucky to have the head of the humanities, Mr. Hall, who's also a psychology and history teacher, and Mr. Clark's just joined him. Mr. Clark is an economist and our university counsellor. So I'm just going to hand directly over to you as a specialist for this question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rees. So the idea then of ethical obligations and the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence. Questions here then about what do we mean by contradictory evidence? What do we mean by contradictory evidence? So if we're talking about evidence that would, in history, for example, undermine an entire aspect of research, an entire proposition, an entire belief, then yes, I would say that there is strong reason to say that any historian who is working as a historian would be obliged to acknowledge this, and they would start from a point of being able to identify a lot of different types of perspective before assuming a particular point of view. So I think then that if you're looking at the weight of evidence, or the type of evidence, and how much there is to contradict a particular perspective, historians probably would not ignore that evidence. For example, if we're talking about the idea of empire, as I mentioned in the previous question, that you can't ignore the perspective of those that were governed when you come to write a review of whether or not the empire was a force for good. However, if evidence is one or two pieces of one eyewitness account or one person's diary entry, say for example you're looking at the experiences of soldiers during the storming of the Normandy beaches in 1944, if you are looking at the account of one or two soldiers that seem to suggest that the experience was fine, it was okay, but 100,000 other soldiers said that it wasn't a good experience and it was traumatic and terrifying, you probably wouldn't necessarily throw out your entire argument based on those one or two findings. But you would probably then still bear in mind that there were soldiers who experienced D-Day in a different way. It could be because they had a quieter part of the line. It could be that they were mentally predisposed to actually find that kind of experience exciting. So I think it comes to the amount of evidence, to the weight of evidence, and to where that evidence comes from and how you weigh it up, whether or not the question is about bearing it in mind when you're writing or actually presenting it as a clear and coherent counterpoint.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's quite a nice question, I think, for us to think about with the humanities. Those of you who are doing economics, we've done quite a bit in the last few lessons looking at economics from a TOK perspective in terms of how we actually approach evidence. And the syllabus that we have now is really one that tries to bring in a lot of psychology, a lot of behavioural economics into what we're doing. Because one of the problems that we had with economics particularly was something that I know you've looked at in this course, in that, let's face it, the really cool system of knowledge is science, natural science. That's the best one. And in natural sciences, biology is a bit dodgy because it's a bit like stamp collecting. But physics, chemistry's okay. Chemistry's a bit, Physics, really, really cool. That's the one. And even cooler than physics is maths. So what economics should try to do, surely, is to be as much like maths as possible. And so there was a whole thing with what was called positive economics. My textbook in year 12 and 13 was called Positive Economics. And this was about logical positivism. How closely can we make economics into a science? And the closer we can get it to be a science, the better. And you'll get a hangover with this if you go to economics, to do economics at university. You can very well do a BSc in economics, Mr. Tasker. You remember BSc economics. Lots of maths, because maths is cool, and anything that looks like maths is better than anything that doesn't. And we've moved away from that. Your syllabus really took a long time to catch up with what's been going on in economics. We've been looking at how people in an economy behave. What motivates them really? Do they just think about maximising pleasure, minimising pain? Do they look at work as bad and leisure as good? Does nobody enjoy work? Does nobody work for reasons other than money? And all of those things have been slowly absorbed into economics. So when we're looking at why people do things, just basic consumer behaviour, we've now been a lot more sophisticated. The evidence that we use has expanded, things that count as evidence now, largely from psychology, wouldn't have counted as evidence in economics 30 years ago. We wouldn't have looked for that. And it's nice that we've incorporated more evidence, whether we have an ethical obligation to do that. I don't know if it's an ethical obligation. I think it's an intention to try to be as good as we can, to try and get as close to an understanding of how things work, of how societies work as possible. And we've definitely brought that into economics. Another big problem with economics with this is to find out what contradictory evidence means. As Mr. Hall suggested in history, does one soldier's diary mean that you tip over all the things that you've learned before? One of the first things that you're taught in economics in year 10 is the term ceteris paribus. If any of you have done economics, you'd learn this, right? This is true, price goes up, demand goes down, ceteris paribus, and we use an old dead language because, again, it makes you sound cool. But other things being equal, we can't do other things being equal experiments in economics. Things are not equal. You can never really do that. So when we're looking at something as big as a macroeconomy, all of the things that happen in there, all the things that go into that are very, very tough to model. So what's going to happen if we cut taxes? If we cut taxes, what will happen? Will we get economic growth when we cut taxes? Will the effects of these trickle down? Will people with lower tax bills produce more? So tax revenue goes up to the government, the economy grows, everybody's happy. It's trickle-down economics. Welcome to the Republican Party. Does this work? No. There's almost no evidence for this working in reality. You get big budget deficits, and it doesn't really seem to happen. But there's a big debate goes on. And how much of this is my political prejudice? It doesn't seem to work. On a more micro level, really, when we look at minimum wage in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's got a minimum wage now, and people were losing their minds when we brought in the minimum wage. Because if we bring in a minimum wage, that means that firms will employ fewer workers, because they're more expensive, there's a demand curve, and you'll have unemployment. You'll create unemployment. Look, I can draw you a graph, I'll show you it. But is that really true? What's the evidence for that? And people have been trying to do research on this in the United States because you have different states with different minimum wage laws. And the evidence tends to suggest that it doesn't happen, that minimum wages don't create unemployment, for reasons that you might imagine. Motivated workers might be better workers, they might be more productive workers. You might encourage people to work who might otherwise be out of the labour force. Firms might want to employ happy, productive workers who are also customers. So, trying to find evidence in economics when you've got an economic controversy, you'd think we'd be able to answer the question about minimum wages now. There's enough evidence, there's enough PhDs being done on the effects of minimum wage in the United States, and you can still get an argument about it. So, while we have an ethical obligation, I think, to follow, do not ignore contradictory evidence, we have a problem in the humanities generally, very often, of working out what counts as evidence. And, as Mr. Hall suggested, how much weight do we then give to evidence that we have? And we're aware that so much of it will be prejudice, entrenched beliefs, what you think about the situation in the first place. What am I going to think about minimum wage? You can guess, I'm somewhat to the left of Lenin. You know what I'm going to say to you about minimum wages, probably. I'm going to be in favour of it. I think it's immoral. I'm going to bring morality into it. To pay somebody, actually the minimum wage in Hong Kong, if you look at what that is, and ask yourself, could you survive on it? The minimum wage that we had where people were going nuts about us getting away from the free market. So when we try to get evidence in the humanities, it's very, very hard. What counts? Stuff that we use as evidence today in economics wouldn't be counted years ago. Whose evidence do we listen to? How do we weight that evidence? And how do we apply it? So in some ways it's an easy question to answer. We shouldn't ignore contradictory evidence. We should have a high degree of intellectual honesty in whatever we do. But by the same token, one piece of contradictory evidence doesn't shoot down a theory. We don't have a huge paradigm shift every time we have a piece of contradictory evidence. We see how it fits into what we have. We see how it works with the body of evidence that exists already before we change tack, before we reject things that we know before. Again, those of you doing economics, we've looked at paradigm shifts in the subject. We've looked at the Keynesian revolution, where people stopped thinking everything looked like a easy supply and demand diagram, that the response to unemployment wasn't to make labour cheaper. And again, there was a huge seismic change in the discipline and a huge seismic change in society as a result of that. But it took a long time. People had to be convinced. People had to try things. And we're often very scared of trying things, because surely governments shouldn't spend more than they take in tax, right? That seems self-evident. Households don't do that. Why on earth can governments do it? And it took a long time before that changed. And then again, we get evidence of things that shouldn't be happening. if you draw a simple Keynesian diagram, sorry non-economists, if you draw a simple Keynesian ADAS diagram, you shouldn't be able to get high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, except welcome to the 1970s. And so we've got to start trying different things. We have to look at evidence. The other thing is evidence on its own won't do it if you're looking at policies. If you're looking at something like geography in the humanities, or you're looking to an extent something like history, you're talking about changing ideas. In economics, we have to change these, transfer these things into policy. What the hell do we do about unemployment? What do we do when nobody can work because there's a COVID epidemic? We have to translate that into policy. How should the government respond? How should we respond as consumers? And that makes things even more problematic because we have to take responsibility. Governments have to take responsibility. And I guess we as voters, if we're lucky enough to be voters, for those decisions. So when we look back at COVID, let's say in 50 years' time, the historians will be doing the history on it and looking at accounts and seeing what happened, looking at the cycle change. Economists will be looking at how well did the policies work. The Hong Kong government, as you know, was basically giving out free money and saying, please go and buy stuff. Please, please, please go and spend money. And then they started saying, you have to spend it or we'll take it back. They gave out consumption vouchers. How effective was that policy? Does that make sense? Did it work? Could it have been done better? So we have an extra ethical obligation because we have not just diagnosis, we have to do treatment. And that, I think, makes the ethical obligation a bit higher. If you're ignoring evidence to the contrary because you've got an ideological bias or a political view or something else, you may be costing lives. And we have to think about that with economics. These policies are life and death issues very often. So I think that's something that you can bring up in there. I think it's a nice question for you, actually. I think it looks quite simple. There's quite a lot to write about with the humanities. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. For human sciences, for humanities, and certainly for economics, as Mr. Clark has just said, many different ways you can talk about this, many different ways you can look at this. I think for psychology as well, there's similar issues here about what is evidence, what isn't evidence, how has what's classed as evidence changed over time, with the addition of things like fMRI and MRI scanners and, you know, being able to view how regions of the brain behave in certain situations, and increased technology, that provides an opportunity to provide contradictory evidence or evidence that may not have been available 20, 30, 50 years ago. So the question here is, though, if contradictory evidence exists, sometimes it is ignored. And it is ignored not necessarily by the psychologists, but by the people that are paying psychologists. So those that are wanting with an agenda to say, well, actually, if we want to produce this drug or we want to produce this kind of treatment, then this piece of evidence is problematic. So we're still going to publish it, or we're still going to let it happen, but we're going to ignore it. We're going to put it into a file drawer so that it doesn't get seen. And we have a replication crisis in psychology. This comes up a lot, and the social sciences, where evidence to the contrary of these things has largely been ignored, or it has been assumed that the research and the evidence conducted is sound and clear enough that it doesn't need to be repeated. So it's not that people have ignored the evidence, it's just that they haven't thought to look for contradictory evidence. So we have studies that produced, that Daniel Kahneman talks about in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, which contradicts some of his views. And he was a good example of somebody with very high ethics that said, well, then I have to relook at what I've been doing. And there was interviews with him after the publication of his book and after the replication crisis became clear, and he was very clear that, well, then I have to reevaluate some of my assumptions, some of my judgments. Not all scientists, not all human scientists are like that. I was thinking as well about, as a historian, a lot of this process goes on in the background. As a historian, you review sources, you look at different sources, and you produce a piece of writing that takes into account all of this stuff in the background. And it might not be clear to a person reading this that has happened. So you might, as a reader, identify, well, they haven't mentioned this piece of evidence. And it is not because they haven't considered it, it has been considered, but it's the magical process that happens in the black box that is not observed by you as a knower that comes out in their writing.